All right, that brings us to cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is what every organism does. Okay, you do this, plants do this too. Okay, if plants need to grow, or if it's not there's no sunlight, they need to maintain their organism's functions, then they'll go through cellular respiration. So this is the process of taking oxygen from the atmosphere and glucose from food to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Energy is in the form of ATP. Now, you need to know this equation, okay, both the word form and the chemical form, which is what you see here. Okay, so you have glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And it says so up at the top here. Oxygen, glucose, carbon dioxide, water, energy. So anyway, you do need to know these equations for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So, all molecules have energy stored in the bonds between their atoms. So, like the glucose, the C6H12O6, that's a lot of atoms there. So, that's a lot of bonds, meaning a lot of energy is stored there. Okay, so this is a summarization of cellular respiration. Okay, so you've got a little human here. He is breathing, he's respirating, he's breathing, taking in oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. Okay, so his reactants, what he starts with, is going to be oxygen and glucose from his ice cream, from his food that he spilled all over his shirt here. Y'all see that? And then his products are going to be water, carbon dioxide, and then ATP. So that's what he ends respiration with. Okay, so what it should say at the top here is that oxidation is the removal of electrons from a molecule, and this causes a decrease in the energy content of that molecule. As you remove electrons, you're removing energy. Okay, so when something is oxidized, electrons are basically transferred to something else. Okay, so some enzymes have helper components called a coenzyme, and those are commonly used in the oxidation to transfer a hydrogen ion. That might sound familiar. A lot of vitamins are considered coenzymes. Specifically, have you ever heard of vitamins, the B vitamins like B12, B6? So anyway, another common coenzyme is pertaining to cellular respiration is NAD and FAD. So that brings us to the opposite of oxidation, which is called reduction. So reduction is going to be the adding of electrons rather than the taking away. So anyway, the oxidized molecules NAD and FAD are reduced to NADH and FADH2 by adding hydrogen ions. So in a cell, these oxidation and reduction reactions are always coupled. So they always happen together. So they're called redox reactions or oxidation reduction reactions. So usually when you see one, you're going to see the other. So glucose oxidation is also called cellular respiration. This is the source of energy in most animal cells. So the complete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide and water produces a lot of energy, and that happens in 4 different stages. Okay, so again, we're talking about removing hydrogen basically here, or adding hydrogen. So if we're completely oxidizing glucose, we're getting rid of all the hydrogen and moving it into the water molecule. Anyway, so this is going to produce large amounts of energy, and it's going to happen in 4 different pathways or 4 different stages. So now we're going to talk about each of these 4 stages. Now it's important to note that a lot of the times this second and third stage are kind of joined. So sometimes you might see it as 3 stages, but that they've just joined the 2 middle phases, if that's the case. So this is just a picture showing the oxidation and reduction usually are going to occur together. So if you look here, we have compound A, And compound A was oxidized, so it lost electrons. And then over here we have B. B gained electrons. So again, these usually kind of happen together. Okay, so now we're getting into cellular respiration. So the first phase of cellular respiration is anaerobic. It's very important to know which phase is anaerobic and which phase is aerobic. So if you recall from learning your prefixes, you should remember that an means without, and aero means air. And in our case, it's going to be oxygen. Now, you should also recall that glyco is sugar and lysis is splitting. So in the first phase, we literally take glucose and split it. So this is the initial splitting of glucose. So this is anaerobic. So oxygen is not needed yet at this point. And this is going to happen in the cytoplasm. So not all of cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. Okay, so it starts in the cytoplasm. So if we're talking about one glucose molecule, when that one glucose molecule is split during glycolysis, the first phase of cellular respiration, then you will get 2 pyruvic acid. You may also see this called as pyruvates. I can't spell. Y'all just have to be with me. Just work with me here. Oh my. This is technical difficulties right here. I'm not sure why my pencil is acting up, but also my brain is acting up. Pyruvates. There we go. So we get 2 pyruvates or pyruvic acids, 2 ATP, and 2 NADH. Okay, so pretty simple. Glycolysis, so glucose is going to be your reactant, and these things are going to be your product. Okay, so 2 ATP, 2 pyruvic acids, 2 NADH. Now, at the end of glycolysis, what you go into next depends on if oxygen is present or not. Now, you know that you have to have oxygen. We know that. Most of your cells can't function without oxygen, but you have certain cells that can, in particular, your muscle cells. So, if you do not have oxygen, then anaerobic respiration will continue. If you do have oxygen, which is most of the time, and most of your cells, then aerobic respiration will occur. So we're going to talk about what happens with normal cellular respiration first when oxygen is present, and then afterwards we'll talk about anaerobic respiration. So again, the first phase is always anaerobic. It does not use oxygen. Okay, so this just shows a couple of pictures showing glycolysis. So if you look up here, glucose is split, and eventually you get your 2 pyruvic acids and your 2 ATPs, and then your NADH. Can't see it over here, but it's over here. Anyway, it's kind of a weird picture. It's kind of showing you the same thing over here. This should be glucose up top. And it's just showing the pathways of how you get your pyruvates and your ATPs and your NADH. All right, so that brings us to the next phase. So remember, I said sometimes phase 2 and 3 can be combined. Okay, so phase 2 is going to be the formation of acetyl coenzyme A. I'm not sure what it says in your notes, but it's something along those lines. Okay, so what's going to happen is those two pyruvic acids you ended glycolysis with are going to go into the mitochondria. So now we're in the mitochondria. So the rest happens in the mitochondria. Okay, so those two pyruvic acids are going to go into the mitochondria. Oxygen is required. Okay, but it's not consumed. But oxygen is required to make this work. So that pyruvic acid gets turned into two acetyl coenzyme A's, then two carbon dioxides, and then two NADHs. Okay, so this is where, again, these are all products. So this is where your carbon dioxide is produced, and the oxygen and your pyruvic acid are going to be your reactants. So, pyruvic acid and oxygen are turned into acetyl coenzyme A, CO2, and NADH. Okay, so that brings us to phase 3 of cellular respiration, and it is aerobic. Remember, that means it requires oxygen. That means oxygen is going to be a reactant. Okay, so this is called the Krebs cycle because a guy named Hans Krebs back in the 30s was one of the people who figured this out. It's also known as the citric acid cycle because of what is produced here. So this happens in the mitochondria still. Again, oxygen is required. And so in the citric acid cycle, those two acetyl coenzyme A's that were reactants, because you ended the previous stage with acetyl coenzyme A, they produce 2 ATP, 4 carbon dioxide, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2s. So these are all products. So again, you can kind of see how they would group these phase 2 and 3 together because they're both producing carbon dioxide and NADH and ATP. Okay, so if you take a look here, we have glycolysis, which is turning the glucose into the pyruvates, okay, and then you get 2 ATP. Then the pyruvate then goes into the Krebs cycle and also forms ATP. So again, looking a little closer, you can see here how your acetyl coenzyme A goes in and forms our carbon dioxide, our NADH, our ATP, and our FADH in the Krebs cycle. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is just another image showing that NADH, carbon dioxide are produced when you form acetyl coenzyme A, and so that goes into the Krebs cycle. And we get our NADH, FADH2, and our ATP, and don't forget the carbon dioxide. So if you're given an image like this or a picture like the chloroplast on your test, it's very important to use that to your advantage because you can use that image on more than one question on your test. Okay, so that is a test-taking strategy that you should watch out for. So now we have phase 4. This is our last phase of cellular respiration, and it's called the ETC, or electron transport chain. And it's called that because it has a lot of redox reactions. Remember how we said how they involve transferring of electrons from the oxidation to the reduction, the removal of electron, then the addition of electron? So this is also going to occur inside of the mitochondria, but specifically it's going to occur in the cristae. You remember the mitochondria kind of looks like this, and y'all know I'm not an artist. Okay, those little squiggles are the cristae. Okay, so that's where this is going to occur. So, NADH and FADH that were produced in the Krebs cycle are going to go into the ETC, the electron transport chain. And this is aerobic, okay? So, again, it's going to have oxygen. So, oxygen and NADH, FADH are going to be reactants. And at the end, they're going to produce 34, anywhere from 32 to 34 ATP. Okay, so these are products here. So that is way more ATP. So these are high energy generating reactions, these redox reactions. And it's also going to produce 6 water molecules. Okay, so depending on if you produce 32 or 34 ATP during the electron transport chain, then you could have anywhere between 36 and 38 ATP molecules generated under normal cellular respiration, where you have plenty of oxygen. So this is just showing the ETC and how the electrons are being transferred from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's generating a lot of ATP at the end. Okay, so this is just a summary here. So at the end of cellular So it's at the end of but it's supposed to be at the end of cellular respiration. Glycolysis made 2 ATPs. Krebs cycle made 2, and then ETC made 32 to 34. You might see it as 32. And so aerobically, that would be 32. Because remember, glycolysis is anaerobic. So if you're talking about aerobic, you wouldn't count that 2. So this would be aerobic. This would be aerobic. So, Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle, that is aerobic, ETC is aerobic. So, the only one that's not is your anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, but if you're looking at the total amount, you would have between 36 and 38 ATP with just general cellular respiration. So, you might be concerned about the previous slide, but you're not going to have anything conflicting like that on your test. Okay, so this is a picture similar to what we saw with the chloroplast in photosynthesis, except this is going to be in cellular respiration in the mitochondria. Now remember, cellular respiration starts in the cytoplasm with glycolysis. And remember, glycolysis is anaerobic, okay, because you see no oxygen there. So with glycolysis, remember, it's cytoplasm anaerobic, and then the other parts are aerobic in the mitochondria. Okay, so your glycolysis is where glucose is broken down into pyruvates. You get your 2 ATP produced, and those electrons are carried in with that NADH molecule. Then, if you look at this picture, they skipped the formation of acetyl coenzyme A, and that's what I was talking about, how you might see that conjoined with the Krebs cycle. Okay, so anyway, that pyruvate becomes acetyl coenzyme A, then it becomes citric acid, which is the Krebs cycle is what it's kind of named for, and you also get ATP produced then. And then those electrons, you get the NADH and the FADH 2 molecules. Those go into the ETC. Then if you notice, you have the biggest ATP here because that's where your most ATP is produced. Okay, so again, we've already mentioned several times that aerobic is using oxygen and anaerobic is without oxygen. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about those processes. So most organisms exhibit aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen. In which of the following places would you most likely find anaerobic organisms? Well, which one of these would you not have oxygen? The intestinal tract of animals. You're going to have oxygen in water because that's how fish breathe. They just breathe differently than you. That's what their gills are for. And it doesn't matter if the habitat is cold or warm or humid or dry. That is still going to have oxygen. Which organelle performs cellular respiration? That would be the mitochondria. Both plant and animal cells have the ability to. Well, hopefully you're thinking to do cellular respiration, because remember I mentioned that plants can do cellular respiration too if they need to grow or if they don't have access to sunlight. So cellular respiration, the end goal is to make glucose for energy. So I told you we were going to talk about anaerobic respiration, and that is without oxygen. So remember earlier we said that all cellular respiration starts with glycolysis. And then if oxygen is present, it goes through the phases we just discussed. Formation of acetyl coenzyme A, Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. But now we're going to talk about if oxygen is not present. So if oxygen is not present, glycolysis still occurs. But then it'll go through what we call fermentation. So there's really mainly three anaerobic respirations: glycolysis and then your two fermentations. So they are anaerobic and oxygen is not present. Okay. Now only certain cells can go through fermentation. So fermentation, the whole goal of this unit is producing energy. But with fermentation, the goal is to produce energy without oxygen. Okay, so the main cells that do this are going to be yeast and muscle cells in animals. So obviously yeast are not animals. But anyway, yeast cells can undergo alcoholic fermentation, and animals can go through lactic acid fermentation in their muscles. And this is what makes your muscles sore, because you didn't get enough oxygen to that particular muscle to keep up with the energy needs of that muscle. And then lactic acid forms as a byproduct when you were making that extra energy, and that builds up into your muscles, and that's why you might feel sore maybe a couple hours later or the next day, because that lactic acid had time to build up and kind of settle into your muscles. So this is typically going to be activity that you wouldn't normally do, because your muscles are used to the activity that they normally do. So anyway, let's talk about the two types of fermentation. Alcoholic. So alcoholic fermentation is going to occur in yeast cells, and this is when oxygen is not present. This is very important for baking and wine. Okay, so the alcohol, obviously alcoholic fermentation is going to produce alcohol. Now, it is also going to produce carbon dioxide, which causes the bread to rise, okay, and also ATP. That's the whole goal here, is to produce ATP without oxygen. And then again, alcohol is a byproduct. Okay, so different alcohols, breads that are made with yeast are going to go through alcoholic fermentation. And again, that's going to help you help the dough rise. The rising of the dough is going to be the little carbon dioxide pockets that are products of this. Okay, so the second type is going to be lactic acid fermentation, and that's what you go through in your muscle cells if you do not have oxygen available. Okay, so so this happens in your muscle cells, and this is going to be just after strenuous activity, not everyday activity. And this is when your body cannot get enough oxygen to those muscle cells to keep up with the energy, the ATP that it needs. So what happens is you do produce energy, you produce ATP, but you also produce lactic acid. And that lactic acid builds up, and it builds up and sets into your muscles, and that causes that muscle soreness and that fatigue, that weakness that you feel. So the products are going to be lactic acid and ATP for that. One other thing with lactic acid fermentation. Sometimes it doesn't just happen in muscle cells. It can happen in some unicellular organisms, like possibly bacteria. The energy from food that is used to produce ATP from ADP is so the energy from food is going to be stored in the bonds of glucose. So energy is stored in the bonds between molecules. As respiration begins, glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid and 2 molecules of ATP are formed. What will happen next in yeast cells if no oxygen is available? Well, hopefully you recall that yeast cells can go through alcoholic fermentation if there's no oxygen available. Which of the following best describes the purpose of cellular respiration? Hopefully you picked production of ATP. Should say of. Okay, and it doesn't just have to be animal cells. Which step in aerobic cellular respiration produces the most ATP? Well, these two are both anaerobic, so it can't be those. If you recall, Krebs forms 2, and ETC forms 32 to 34. So hopefully you picked the ETC. The aerobic process in cellular respiration uses the products of glycolysis in a series of enzyme-catalyzed reactions in the mitochondria to release CO2. This process is called. Okay, so this is aerobic. It is in cellular respiration. Okay, and it's using the products of glycolysis, so that tells me it's going to be after glycolysis. Okay, now we should automatically eliminate photosynthesis and Calvin cycle, because those are both parts of photosynthesis. They're not parts of cellular respiration. Okay, and hopefully you recall that Krebs cycle is aerobic. Krebs cycle also releases CO2. And fermentation is anaerobic. And this specifically says an aerobic process. So the answer should be Krebs cycle. So finishing up here, we're going to compare. So comparing photosynthesis and cell respiration. Remember I mentioned that the equations are basically opposites? So photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, and water are the materials used. So they are the reactants of photosynthesis, and they are the products of cell respiration. Cell respiration takes place in every living cell, whereas in photosynthesis, it's going to only be cells that have chlorophyll. Photosynthesis builds sugars. So sugars are a product of photosynthesis. Whereas cell respiration breaks down sugar. So that's going to be reactant. So glucose and oxygen are products of photosynthesis, but they are reactants of cell respiration. And finally, photosynthesis produces 2 ATP, whereas cell respiration produces up to 38 ATP. So, again, looking at these equations, and I'm sorry my arrows didn't translate perfectly, the end products of aerobic respiration are the starting materials of photosynthesis. So here I have my carbon dioxide, here I have my glucose and oxygen, and these are my reactants of cell respiration, but if you look over here, they are my products of photosynthesis. And then again, my carbon dioxide, water, and energy are my products of cell respiration, but they are my reactants of photosynthesis. So this is an excellent image showing both photosynthesis and cell respiration on a cellular level with the organelles, the chloroplasts, and the mitochondria. So it's looking at, if you look, it's saying it's in the ecosystem, okay? So this is showing the recycling of those important inorganic compounds and organic compounds that are produced. So if you look, we'll start here with the sunlight, which was the ultimate energy source. And that light energy goes into the chloroplast in photosynthesis. And then that produces your organic molecules, which is going to be your carbohydrates, your glucose, and also your oxygen gas. Then the carbohydrates and the oxygen gas go into the mitochondria for cell respiration. So ATP is going to be made in order to power that organism's body, and heat is going to be a byproduct. And then cell respiration will also produce water and carbon dioxide, which then goes back into the plant, so the plant can begin photosynthesis again. So this kind of shows how in an ecosystem, all the organisms are important and depend on each other. In which of these processes does the sun's energy play a direct role? Well, hopefully you're thinking about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is not respiration, but photosynthesis does produce glucose, so you might see it as glucose synthesis also. Which of the following statements is false? Cellular respiration is a metabolic process that releases energy that's stored in the bonds of glucose to form ATP. That is true. Photosynthesis is a two-part reaction that uses the sun's energy to produce glucose from carbon dioxide and water. That is also true. ATP acts as the energy currency of cells by giving up two phosphate molecules in an electron transfer. And then your last choice, ATP acts as the energy currency of cells by giving up two phosphate molecules in an electron transfer. Well, ATP does act as the energy currency, but it doesn't always give up two phosphates. That would be ATP, ADP plus phosphate. That's typically what happens. You wouldn't do AMP plus phosphate plus phosphate. So basically, they're saying you would skip a step. So this would be the false answer. Which process supplies the energy needed to produce ATP in the cell? So if you need the energy to produce ATP, producing ATP is going to be cellular respiration. Which of the reactions would result in the greatest release of energy? Okay, so if you're thinking about energy, hopefully you're thinking about ATP. So you would eliminate these two choices. Now, if you recall, releasing energy is breaking bonds. So in this choice, we have ATP, and we broke the bond, so then that released energy. So this is going to be the best choice. Now in this one, we made a bond, so we stored, or you also may see it as absorbed energy. So if this was worded differently, then that would be the answer.